So I'm going to start here because this is actually one of my favorite things to talk about. I come from not a strictly technical background, so awareness and training and dealing directly with people is something that I revel in. It's something that I really enjoy. So I'm excited that we have this one today. James, tell me a little bit about awareness and training from your perspective and how you engage with your team on like the side of your MSP, not with your end clients, but how important is this for you in your everyday practice?
So I think one of the things that in our everyday practice, one of the things is like, that's key to us is identifying what the role is of the person in the organization and how that role aligns with other duties within the organization that fall under that compliance framework, right? And when I say that, I mean there's all this compliance stuff. It's always so tightly interweaved, and everything is so reliant upon one another that each one of those elements has an effect on whose role actually falls within a security related duty and responsibility, right? So, like in our organization, being able to take, let's say, an example, we're going to use a CTO, right? So our CTO,
Big dog.
yeah, big dog, right? But what's the CTO really going to have from a security related perspective? They're going to have overarching security responsibilities related to your own internal infrastructure in our company, right? They're going to have requirements related to the provision of services on our client's infrastructure. They're going to have responsibilities related to the tools that we use and the products and the vendors that we pick, right? And then not only that, but they also have like data fiduciary responsibilities related to things that we're storing for corporate data, right? Not just the systems, but the actual data itself. And so you have to kind of take each role and you start to identify what the responsibilities are for those people in their role and where that responsibility lies in terms of the overall organization. I'm a big fan of mind mapping. So, like if you use a mind map and you think of it from that perspective, right? Take the role, break out all the different responsibilities of that role, take another role in the organization, right? Let's say it's like an analyst, right?
Mhm.
And take that role and see where do those actually intersect. And where those two things intersect, you can actually use that to help develop your policies and your procedures so that that way you have consistency amongst the organization. And then you can figure out based on that in the framework, where does that actually fit? So if you have two people with similar responsibilities, but maybe their job duties are different, the policy and procedures used inside of that job are going to end up aligned to that one single control that you've placed. So it makes it less daunting. I think it's really daunting for people to look at a whole organization and say, maybe I've got 50 or 100 people. How do I actually get to a point where I can figure out how to wrap my hands around compliance? That's the simplest place to start. Is think about all your people, all the duties they do, all the jobs they do, all the systems they touch, and then figure out how everybody's all interconnected.
So that sounds super complicated.
I'm glad you said it.
It does, but if you can keep breaking down to like a key level, right, and say, okay, like let's just think of like from a responsibility perspective, like if we say like human resources, right, and we start there and we just break it up at a departmental level, who may touch human resources, right? Then we can say, okay, now we could really break down underneath that if we needed to go from a sub level. But yeah, it could be super complicated. It could be as complicated as you want to, but I think it's like IT people, right? We're as complicated as we want to be, or we can be as simple as we want to be.
Yeah, well, so there's a lot of awareness and training controls out there in like different sets. This one's from NIST 800-171 Rev.3, which is the latest standard on stuff that private businesses have to do to sell stuff to the federal government, right? This is a list of things, and Rev.3 is pretty new, that you're legally not allowed to sell to the government unless you've considered every control on this list. Now, different controls may be required or not, depending on contract, depending on the organization's risk. But if you're selling to the government, you're going to trip over NIST 800-171. And this specific one, and it's worth noting, a lot of people get trapped down the 800-171 hole because for many organizations, it's the first time they've had to take security seriously. The government says, "Are you secure?" And they scratch their head and they're like, "Yeah, sure." And the government says, "Prove it. Here's NIST 800-171." And this is the first time, like an MSP's client, all of our clients are out there thinking about cybersecurity, and they're always tempted to drive their whole cybersecurity program based on NIST 800-171. But it's worth, and you can see it right here, why why you as the MSP should push back on that. Right in the language of this control, it says before authorizing access to the system, comma, CUI, comma, and so stop right there. CUI, controlled unclassified information, right? So like the government's primary concern here is protect our data, right? Protect our data and make sure your people are trained in how to deal with it, right? Don't let them have access to the CUI unless they're trained on how to deal with CUI. And when the system changes, make sure they're trained on how to deal with CUI. And if you go down the NIST 800-171 list, they're all written like this. Here's how to protect the government in 100 different ways. And that's not, if you're trying to protect your own organization, right? You're trying to stop breaches. You're trying to get cyber insurance. This is not the list for you, right? And so NIST 800-171 is something you normally pair up with an internal control standard. For most MSPs, this is CIS. Sometimes it's NIST CSF or something else. You pair that up, and you do have to do mappings between them. But what the government's concern here is that do the people that work for you, subcontractor or contractor, do you understand your security duties based on your job function when you encounter CUI, controlled unclassified information? And there's other controls in here that talk about federal contract information. So even the name of the contract officer, the name of the contract, the address that you deliver stuff to, are need to be controlled and secured. So,
Matt, I'd love to ask you a question. So on these forms here, it gives a control type, and this one is typed as basic. Obviously, when you're dealing with a people process or a people element of cybersecurity, it's usually going to be anything but basic because people are incredibly complex. How do they define these control types? And
they think it's basic, and little smile and nod here, right? Because they think you contractor, government contractor, you already do cyber awareness training, right? Just add CUI to that. Consider our data when you're considering your data, which of course presumes that you've already got the awareness and training program in place. It is not simple. It is not basic to put that awareness and training program in place. It requires finding an awareness and training vendor. It requires sometimes doing standalone training because the training vendor is not always going to have all the answers, and it's not going to be tailored to your systems, right? There's a lot of work that needs to go into this. But in terms of how they're labeled, it's not technically complex to add CUI, controlled unclassified information, to the list of things that an organization normally needs to secure. The government's concern here is that, okay, great company, you've been protecting your stuff, but can you protect our stuff too, right? And that's why they say it's basic.
One of the things to remember about CUI too is that it's CUI, and I'm not going to talk about it from a responsibility side, right? I'm going to talk about how you can actually classify, like not what would be CUI, but like what are we talking about, right? We're talking about data storage, data transmission, right? And potentially you could have CUI that's printed, right? So really, if you think about it this way, data or any kind of metadata storage or transmission, right? That's really what it is. And then who has access to that information? And then can you determine that access is actually adequate? So that's really, like, if I wanted to like break it down at the most basic level, that would be how I would say that's what this whole thing is. Right?
That made a lot of sense from a basic perspective, and the way that it initially looks is pretty complicated. So I appreciate you guys breaking that down for everybody.